That says you're playing, so you go ahead and start your introduction since probably most people have started coming up.
Hey everybody, I'm Cody Pondsmith, lead writer on the Witcher tabletop role-playing game, and this is Lisa Pondsmith, lead writer on the lore and my partner in crime. I'm sure many of you know this by dropping by our booth. We are the two people who wrote this fine manual here over the course of many years and much hardship. So I am weirdly bad at seminars, but great at Q&As. So I try to make every seminar I do a Q&A. If you get me on an interesting topic, I could talk forever, but I like to mostly answer people's questions and clear up anything that anybody is confused about. So yeah, that being said, I guess mostly system questions are going to go to me. A lot of the world questions will go to Lisa. We'll kind of jump back and forth. And I guess I'll throw it out there to if anybody's got anything to ask or anything. Hello.
Hi. What's up?
We don't have microphones, so you're going to have to talk reasonably loud.
So, I got some questions about what is the intended party for the game? Party balance-wise.
Intended party balance-wise is kind of an interesting one. We, to some extent, because the professions are less structured than, say, a D&D or a Pathfinder, party balance is weirdly not quite as important. Anybody can fill a combat role, for instance. Anybody can more or less fill a healing role. Like, I would say in your ideal party, it's usually probably good to have at least one Witcher, because you'll probably encounter monsters, assuming you're running a... Yeah, a mage is always good because a mage is a very versatile player to have in the game. Their spells and rituals allow them to cover a wide variety of fields and do a lot of different things. A doctor is usually a good idea if your players are going to be getting into a lot of combat, because they are going to be the only ones who can heal critical wounds. And while you can go to a doctor in town, it is easier and cheaper to have one in your party.
What was the balance in some of the more successful groups you've run?
See, I ran a really pretty successful playtest group through a number of sort of sessions. That was a craftsman who spent most of their time sort of making stuff and augmenting weapons for their party. A merchant who would get everybody into towns, and you would usually act as the face for the party so that people didn't throw them out of towns. A witcher who dealt with sort of making sure everybody knew what would work and wouldn't work against monsters. And a mage who would do sort of the more complicated like magical stuff. They picked up a man-at-arms later who was more on sort of the archery level, so they were a bit more of a sniper character. Once again, it's kind of one of those where a lot of your ideal party is based on what game you're going to be in. Because I've also had really successful parties that were running like a doctor, a criminal, and the merchant. So it kind of depends on what type of game you're in.
I don't know if all of you guys have been by the book or not, so I'll say it. One of the biggest questions when we got the license was, what are you going to do so that not everybody's a Jedi, basically. And so that is something that we have actively been working on and balancing for all the years we've been working on the book.
We didn't want it to be it is the Witcher RPG, but we didn't want it to be a group of 5 people sits down and everybody plays a Witcher, or a group of 5 people sits down and then summarily murders each other to figure out who's going to be the Witcher. We wanted to make sure that, somebody could play the Witcher, maybe 2 people could play Witchers, but there would be options for other people so that you didn't walk in and go, okay, I've got a party full of Witchers, what are we going to do? I guess we're killing monsters.
Will that work though?
It'll work, yeah. I liken it to Letho and his Kingslayers in Witcher 2, for those of you who played the video games. You are ex-Witchers who are out doing things hired by people as assassins, or maybe just going out and killing monsters. Or if Geralt and the other Wolf School Witchers were like, they had a contract that no one of them could, handle. So it will work. Mostly we just suggest that you don't, because mostly Witchers pursue one type of game. There's not a lot of flexibility in what they do. How do we have a...
So, we can ask questions from that at the very end, so if
Okay.
you unlock that. Since I'm sure people have lots of questions. I think I saw one back here.
I just maybe to focus the question on the how you keep Witchers from being not Mary Sue, but
OPs,
a little
yeah.
bit overpowerful and more than just Witchering, which they might be the source material. So can you dig into what a DM can expect from a Witcher in the party? How are they balanced compared to?
The Witcher in your party is going to be an incredibly powerful fighter, but probably only in swordsmanship. They can put things in other weapon skills, but all of their most of their abilities are geared towards swordsmanship. So they'll be a really potent player in combat. Most of their spells, their signs, are combat focused, and the one that isn't, which is Axie, is useful in a social scenario, but it's far more visible and obvious than, say, for instance, I think it's called Emotion Attack. It's one of the spells the mage has, which does kind of the same thing, but it's a bit less obvious in some places. They could tip into more sort of alchemy stuff, where they'll be making potions and probably some alchemical stuff, but they don't start with as wide a knowledge of alchemy. The weird thing about Witchers is, except for their combat prowess and their knowledge of monsters, they tend to be sort of a jack of all trades. They're kind of good at magic, but they're not as good as a mage. They're kind of good at alchemy, but they're not as good as an alchemist. So they kind of dip into everything, and it's mostly their knowledge of monsters and their sword skill that puts them above the rest. As they level up, they'll become more dangerous in combat. Mostly, most of their abilities kind of focus on combat, because that's kind of what they do. But you can easily make a fairly balanced party with them. And weirdly enough, most people embrace role-playing the Witcher so much that most of the parties I have, you get 4 people and a Witcher, and the Witcher spends most of the time in the back of the party, most of the time grumbling comedically about situations they get into until a monster shows up. And at that point, they pull out the sword and they go to work hunting a monster.
But the disads of Witchers.
Yeah, Witchers, because we're keeping to canon for both the books and the games, no new Witchers have been made in right around 25 years. And most of the schools are defunct entirely. So any Witcher you play is a Witcher who was mutated many, many, many decades in the past, and has mostly been lying low for the last several years as people stop needing Witchers. For those of you who have only played the games, in the books there are actually almost no monsters, really. Witchers were so effective that they wiped out most of the monster species, to the point where we have situations where scholars... We had a situation, there's one in the books, I think it's in Blood of Elves, where a scholar is talking about, Geralt's talking about a monster, and the scholar goes, no, that's just an urban legend. That never has existed. And 20 pages later, the monster shows up. And the scholar is going, "My God, Witcher, you were right. I will alert the scholars immediately. I'll have it named after you." And Geralt's going, "It's already got a name."
And there's the fact that a lot of people don't like or trust Witchers.
Yeah, we have a social standing system to emulate the really prevalent sort of racism throughout the continent. And that affects how NPCs deal with you. It not only gives you some actual system negatives depending, but it kind of informs the GM how people should deal with you. And Witchers have the double whammy of being both hated and feared. So from hated, they take fairly significant penalties to charisma and seduction and persuasion and whatnot. And from feared, they get a bonus to intimidation, but they get more penalties to charisma. So when a Witcher enters a town, I swear to you, if you run a party of 5 Witchers and they walk into a town, the streets should be empty. 2 seconds flat, everyone runs inside, and the guards run outside, and the guards don't even want to be outside, but they'll do it because it's their job. So that's why you have a lot of these other groups, so that you can walk into a town and, for instance, your merchant or your bard can go up to the local innkeep, and the local innkeep will look at the Witcher, and the bard will say, "Oh no, I needed protection against monsters, so I hired the Witcher. They're perfectly harmless."
You come in with cat's eyes, and there's no real disguise for that.
I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
All right.
We got one here.
So the way you're talking about the way Witchers interact with the world, you show a very good understanding of the source material, because that would be the weakness of playing Witcher. Nobody likes them, and they hire them mostly because they're kind of forced to. That tells me that you're informed about the world. So what I would like to know is more about the creative process. Once you got the license, what were the materials and resources that you had at your disposal to be able to delve into the lore and bring it into an RPG?
Actually, that's a very interesting one. The book's been coming out one by one in English, so it's been an interesting process.
I want to start out on this one.
Go.
So the first thing we got was they gave us a list of all of the franchise things, what we could and could not reference. And I think it was the only things we couldn't reference were the original role-playing game that came out in Poland, which is apparently terrible. I've never been allowed to look at it, and I've never found it in English. The old comics from Poland, which are amazing if you haven't seen them. It's this amazing sort of I'd almost say late 80s kind of Conan the Barbarian style comic art. And it's fantastic. And the TV show and the movie, because apparently no one likes them. Secret fact, I love them. I love old, horrible, campy fantasy, so I love them. But they gave us that, and they said, okay, you can reference all the books that Sapkowski wrote, and you can reference all of our video games and anything we put out. So we sat down with this list, and originally we had this list of okay, this is okay, this isn't okay. And from there, I sat down and played at least some of all the games. I went all the way through Witcher 3, I went through Witcher 2, I went back and made comments, and I kept notes, and she sat down and just started reading all of the books. And I do not exaggerate. She sat down and was just pouring through these books. She would sit there and underline every bit of information that would be even vaguely interesting. There was at one point, in preparation for possible later products, she sat down, went through every book, and underlined every monster that was ever mentioned in the books.
To emphasize this point, I, as a family member, his wife, daughter-in-law, we pitched this in 2012. It's been 6 years. That's longer than over half of our relationship.
Yeah.
And I played Witcher completionist. This has been an epic journey of information.
But so we started poring over this. And the weird thing about the franchise is it has never been really unified. So there are a lot of sort of tiny inconsistencies. So we get things.
Say maps?
Well, maps are one thing. we'd go through and we'd find something, and shortly after we started in on this, I had read Last Wish, and I was starting into Blood of Elves, and I was playing video games. And we sat down and compiled a list of I think it was 40-something questions that we sent off to CDPR, and we were like, can you answer these? Because there's some weird stuff in here. My favorite is, there is one story in Last Wish where Geralt offhandedly, they're hunting, some may know this story, they're hunting Geralt and Dandelion wind up dealing with a satyr in one of the towns, and they're in a giant field of hops, and, Dandelion is going, Geralt, use your magic on it, and Geralt offhandedly says, no, the presence of hops and hemp diminishes magic, and that spawned 5 questions. It was can a mage get drunk? If a mage gets drunk, can they use magic? If you throw hops on a mage, can they use magic?
If you've been smoking the hemp, can you use
and we sent out this enormous list of questions, and we got some of them answered kind of piecemeal back, and then a lot of it was just sort of we would go through, and I'd be I was writing the core system, and we'd take stuff from the video games and be like, okay, so we want to have a bunch of monsters, so we figured out some of the monsters, and we'd be getting early, because Witcher 3 had only been announced a month or two after we made this deal. So they would send us early Prima guide, just barely in layout stuff, and I'd be like, oh, this monster's going to be in the game. I guess I'll write about that. So we'd go through and we'd write this stuff in, and on her side, she would be researching all of the different countries and making, huge lists of information. We'd be listing all of the cities that were in all the different kingdoms. So a lot of it was basically just a combination of we compile enormous stacks of information and then be like, okay, I can put this here in the design, and we can put that there in the design, and I'll write a rule for doing this. And we just kind of almost taped it together into a game and then started polishing it.
I have a notebook, and I would start out with 1 page for each province. I was very happy and very lucky. As most of you know from the books of the games, you don't get the Nilfgaard a lot. And yet, here it is, this big empire looming over the game the whole time.
Literally about 2/3 of the known world if you follow the Witcher 2 map.
And we looked at it and said, oh my gosh, there's 2 lines about Mecht in all 7 books. So I took everything that was in the books, everything I could find. We meet somebody who's a Mechtian, what do they say about him? And then created the country profile from that using what little we knew.
And a combination of that and because I do a lot of world building in my spare time, she would put that together, and then we would sit down. We had a meeting where we sat down together and looked at the actual map and said, okay, this country is in the foothills. What does that mean about the country? This country is along the coastline. They probably have a fair amount of coastal trade. This country is in a bunch of swamps. What does that mean about this country? So a ridiculous amount went into putting this together. But I loved every minute.
There. We got a question here, then there.
Okay.
From your comments, I get the picture that you kind of view the Witcher as a gunslinger. Are you a fan of old westerns or anything like that? The bad guy comes to town to protect, do something.
I love the Western genre because it works, in a lot of cases, it works really, really well for, A, it's fun, and B, it works really well for a good role-playing game because it gives you the opportunity to have your players travel through a town and, they stop off in a town and maybe, you're going Magnificent Seven and there's a group of bandits who are extorting the town and your players get to be the Magnificent Seven or whatnot. It gives a really good, almost road map play, so your campaign can go through a bunch of different places, and your players can have a bunch of, exciting but still sort of contained adventures.
and they kind of know what to expect.
I view Witchers as sort of 50% sort of mysterious stranger, Old West gunslinger, and 50% film noir detective, like mashed together at high speed. I hope that helped answer that.
We got one more over here.
Okay, so first, I guess I'm not as experienced with tabletop gaming as
Uh-huh.
I am with The Witcher lore.
Okay.
Can you kind of just give a rundown? Like, so I've played like a couple editions of D&D, and that's pretty much it. Do you want to give us a little rundown of like the combat system, or
Yeah, sure. That was another one. I spent a lot of time working on the combat system to make it fit Witcher. As many of you probably know, part of our deal with CDPR was that the system would be based on Cyberpunk, one of our other games. But I learned, perhaps a little bit too late, that Cyberpunk is it's a sort of near future setting, so most of the combat is gunfights. And you don't really do gunfights in Witcher. So there's a lot of stuff that had to be rewritten to fit the sort of fast-paced sword fight mechanics in Witcher. The combat itself is, we aim to make it fast, very deadly, and to some extent very flashy. We have, basically, as you get into combat, you start by rolling initiative like you would in many other systems. Your reflex statistic plus a die roll, and you go from top to bottom, highest number to lowest number. And you can basically move and make one action. That can be drawing a weapon, that can be attacking, that can be casting a spell, something like that. Because we wanted to keep it basically like, I move here, I do this. I move here, I do this. We wanted to keep it from really bogging down so we could keep that fast feeling. There are a lot of options for combat if you choose to use them. We have a bunch of special moves that were carried over from Cyberpunk and some that were added. Things like pommel strikes with sword pommels, trips, charges, grabs and throws, things like that. If you really want to get flashy about it, I find that those are a lot of fun because you can get really sort of fun cinematic combats out of it. But the really big sort of point is we added a critical wound system, which many of you, if you bought the book, have probably seen, by which, depending on how skilled you are compared to your opponent, or sort of how lucky you are compared to your opponent in some cases, the higher you roll as an attack above your opponent's defense, you are able to score these horrible visceral critical wounds, as I call them, that apply bleeding effects, and some of them horrible things like your stomach acid is pouring out into your gut and things like that. Because, on one hand, on the video game side, we wanted to give people who had played the games the same sort of feeling as you get from like the cutscene finishers in Witcher 2 and Witcher 3. And on the book side, I kept coming back to one of the other scenes in Last Wish, where Geralt is fighting Renfri, the ex-princess, and her band of bandits, which is basically Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, but with bandits. And Geralt walks into the center of town, and all these bandits come at him, and they're some of the fiercest, most dangerous guys in all of the Northern Kingdoms. And he draws his sword, and in just he kills 7 people in as many seconds by just pinpoint, just slicing through arteries, moving to the next, slicing through an artery. And he does the same thing with Renfri. So you've got this if you're a tremendously skilled fighter, your strength is that you're fighting somebody less skilled than you, and you can, aim to do those really sort of critically wounding and crippling attacks so you can end the fight really quickly.
But then, back to being a Witcher again, he does this and saves the town, and they say, gee, thanks, and leave now and don't come back, because you scared the heck out of us.
Yeah,
and that's how he gets the tag the Butcher of Blavik.
Our next question is over there.
Well, real quick, did that answer it?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Great.
First, I want to thank you for putting Roach on the roof.
Yes. Well, I actually I did that for a very specific reason. I always try to have as it says in there, the NPC. When you're running a game, it's really useful to have one player who kind of tags along, or one character who kind of tags along with the players and can kind of push them into situations. And weirdly enough, Roach is often sort of portrayed as that character, you know. But yeah, go ahead.
So, well, it actually is kind of fits in with that. In books, favorite character was courageous, and in games, Judy.
Yeah.
So, what would you say if someone wanted to play a monster?
Okay.
Ally?
First, I would say that the minute we put higher vampires in the game as a playable class, I think most of the game would change, because I think higher vampires are possibly the most overpowered creature I have ever seen in the franchise.
Well, somebody destroys him and he soaks into the floor.
No. Someone turns him into glass and he comes back. Anyway, I don't know that we're ever going to really do... I can't say never. I have no plans at the moment to do playable monster races at the moment, just because that would add sort of a whole nother layer of stuff. But we will... I can talk about this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I am definitely looking at, in further bestiaries, monsters like the sort of sentient monsters and the monsters that you run into more as characters, the higher vampires, the dragons, the Dopplers, things like that. Rather than having sort of a bestiary entry, we're looking at doing more of sort of like, this is a more unique thing. If your characters run into a higher vampire, you know, you make that higher vampire. You don't just use like a stock higher vampire. You know, that is a special character in the setting.
I like Rage's like college days, background story, books. That was very good.
Can you talk about the curse in Werewolf? Because that ties into there. If I'm not correct, you did mention characters being cursed.
Oh, yes. Werewolves are kind of an exception, but not really. You can become a werewolf via curses, but it's kind of in that category of when you become a werewolf, it's kind of up to the GM whether you play your character during that time period or not. I have had players who I would 100% let them play their character while they were in werewolf form, because your really major difference is basically, it's like you, but evil. And I've had players who could play their character, but evil. There are definitely some players who can't, and, you probably want to take over at that point. But, that is, I think, the one sort of largest playing a monster sort of situation.
Can I insert anything else?
Oh, what?
No, go ahead. Are you planning on any kind of adventure module?
Yes. I don't know when we're going to do them. I don't even necessarily know what's going to be in them, but we are planning to do at least a number of adventures.
So we've got 1, then 2.
All right. Can I do 2 questions real quick?
Yes.
Tying into that.
Yes, but I want to see what you're drawing afterwards.
I'm going to show you when you.
Okay.
Tying into that, if you wanted to, before anything that you physically released for creating the high vampires, could you still use what is in this book to create your own high vampires for your own personal games and stuff like that?
If
like
you
what
are,
you have right now.
If you are a game designer, yes.
We don't really know anything about what the limitations.
We do to some extent. We do to some extent. They explain a lot of things in Blood and Wine. They explain a lot of things in the books. The major problem is kind of twofold, in that you would have to house rule quite a bit of stuff, because even the Catacan is in that category where it's kind of a higher vampire, but it's kind of not a higher vampire. There was a lot of confusion over we had a lot of confusion over that because of one quest in Witcher 3 where you deal with somebody who is kind of hinted to be a higher vampire or something like that, and when you fight them they turn into a Catacan. we originally had catechans with the ability to take more human shapes, but we spoke with CDPR and they said that that was really mostly because they didn't have anything implemented for having real higher vampires in the game at that point. And also because the weird quirk of higher vampires having a unique ability, which we don't really have anything in there at the moment. Probably the closest I would say is you'd probably make a character, probably make like a human without any of the human traits, and then maybe give them the claws of the catecan and most of the catecan's abilities, and then just sort of house rule that if you're not killed by another higher vampire, that your character comes back after a certain amount of time.
Alright.
That's kind of the best I can figure. And then you'd have to do something for the mist effect. I might use a variancy, like slightly tweak the teleportation spell. But we will eventually touch on higher vampires because they're such a cool part of that world.
Yeah. The second question, how did you deal with the art orders, and what all did they give you to work into the book?
So, the deal was that they gave us all of the art.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
We put that in the contract.
So that's why there are like 30 artists labeled in this book. We were incredibly lucky in that they gave us a raft of concept art. And they basically gave us all of the world book art and all of the concept art from Witcher 2 and Witcher 3. And that was pretty good. But we got, to some extent, incredibly lucky because they then started into Gwent for real. So we started to get, rafts of really, really nice art. I got that and I remember going, wow, I can put a lot more art in this book now. We only actually commissioned 2 pieces of art specifically from them, which were the 2 pictures of Rodolphe Cosmer and Brandon Moxenfurt, who are our 2 narrator characters. And then, a lot of the sigils and symbols and things I personally made on Photoshop with my basic knowledge of Photoshop, and all of the heraldry was done by our art director, who sat down and did all of it after I figured it all out. The dumbest fact about that is I created most of the heraldry that had not been created as much as I could to actual heraldic rules. Just because, So yeah, it was mostly sort of like siphoning through and going through and searching through, pages or folders and folders of art and going, okay, this looks good here.
Although, for amusement's sake, we got a lot of the art in a lot of different forms.
Yeah.
Would you like the what was it? 1 DPI?
No, that was different. No, I was looking up a picture that I think I didn't remember that I had somewhere else. That was a picture of a wraith, and I downloaded it online from somewhere because it was an official piece of CDPR art. And I couldn't find it anywhere else, and I uploaded it. And one day I'm going through and I'm making sure that all of the working pictures are of reasonably good DPI where we could. And I was like, wow, this picture is 5,000 inches by 2,000 inches and 1 DPI. It was pretty crazy.
That sounds horrible.
Your next question code is up here.
Thank you, by the way, for putting all the effort into making this. It looks like it's going to be awesome.
I hope so.
Mechanically speaking, you were talking about with the combat, how you were talking about the veins and arteries and all sorts of nasty stuff like that. Is the combat set up to be more focused instead of just I move to enemy and I roll attack, or is it more of a descriptive, I'm going to attempt a certain type of swing or a takedown?
It is to some extent as much as you want to make it either way. It never hits sort of an AC system where it's really straightforward, just walk up and, attack. But, if you want, you can play it pretty solidly as, I walk up, I want to make an attack. You will, roll for a random location. You don't have to, aim for anything. You can just sort of, do whatever. and you don't really have to touch on any of the like throws and grabs and things like that. It definitely helps. We wanted to keep the feel of Witcher combat, so there are a lot of small things like we have one of the forms of defense is called reposition, and instead of just dodging the attack and staying in one place, you dodge the attack and move a certain distance away from where you were, which is really important because the more enemies you have attacking you, the larger the penalties to defend against them. So if you sort of stand in one place, you'll get surrounded by neckers, for instance, and you'll be at a place in your life where those neckers are getting like a +5 to hit you because they're just surrounding you. Whereas, necker runs up, you dodge back out of the way. Now if a second necker runs up, it's not going to get a bonus because there's no longer that one necker on you. That being said, we have tried to keep it sort of as easy as possible so that people can pick it up pretty quickly. I've run 3 games here so far, mostly with people who have never played any of our products before, and I've been able to explain combat in like 10-15 minutes. Not going into the really complicated stuff.
And if I could ask a small other one too.
Yeah?
How close is the actual lore from like the games or the current stuff with Geralt and stuff? Like, because the characters are in here, how close is that tied to the mechanics? Is it possible to play, a campaign and have nothing to do with Geralt or?
That was the plan.
Oh yeah.
That was the plan. Part of the reason. Oh, go ahead.
But we did feel that people who played games and read the books would want to see. Would want to see, oh, how did they stat that person?
Oh, also, I think a lot of people want to have that moment where they've done like 5 sessions and they like come into a tavern and like they see Geralt for a minute. Or like, maybe they do one adventure with him. They are that NPC that you meet for one side quest. But part of the reason we fleshed out the world so much is because we wanted to say like, okay, I want to be, an ex-military smuggler operating out of, the province of Gamera in Nilfgaard. I never see Geralt. I never hear about Ciri other than the fact that her doppelganger is my current empress. I never encounter any of the witch hunt. I just do my, smuggling ring in Gamera. You don't really have to interact with the main plot line, but it's there if you want it.
Thank you.
I see a question there, and then.
I'm new to DMing.
Yeah.
And most of my experience has been in more like apocalypse world, like simple games. And
Yeah.
A few times I've done D&D, it was a little bit overwhelming because of keeping track of how many members and stats. Would you say that your system might be? Would you prefer? Would you recommend that DM that maybe has more experience with
Tara Jones, my wife. I recently taught her this system and have been having her run at the
3 days I've known this system.
At the convention. So I'll let her give her 2 cents and then I'll jump in.
I've been here for the whole process of making it, but trust me, it's not been the same system all 6 years. I've run 3 games in the last week. I've had the book, I guess it's 4 days now? It's Friday. It must be.
Yeah, it was not long.
I've not had the book long, but to pick it up and run it is so easy, particularly if you know Fusion at all. It's stat plus skill plus your die roll equals the DC. 2 characters can oppose each other. Whoever rolls the best wins. Super simple layout, particularly if your group is story heavy. My first 2 campaigns I ran, the first group adopted the monster because he's a werewolf. They rolled really well. This is what you get from having a merchant in the party, apparently.
Merchants and bards.
I was expecting a bard to do that. The second group avoided all combat entirely, despite having a witcher, because they intimidated and talked their way out of it. All combat was basically avoided in that second scenario. This last game I just ran this morning went, fuck it, we're going to be your most violent group ever. The dwarf exploded. Just saying, make your alchemical rolls right. But yes, it's really easy to pick up, and it's really nice because you can add layers of rules. You wanted to pitch it, I could tell.
Yeah. We also have a relatively long GM's guide towards the back of the book that not only goes over how to run Witcher adventures and like how to set up encounters and stuff like that, but for people who are just sort of starting to get into, especially games with more system and sort of starting to get into running games, it has just sort of information and help on some of the stuff that I have seen people have the most trouble with. So I like to think that the GM's guide in here will be really good to kind of help you into that, but the system should not be tremendously difficult to set up. It's not, for instance, like a Pathfinder type setting or Pathfinder type system with a lot of feats and abilities. Each character, if they get every ability that their class offers, has like 10 special abilities that you really have to keep track of, and they're all very simple to pick up. And beyond that, it's mostly skills and items. So it's fairly easy to keep track of. The only time the bookkeeping gets a little bit difficult is if you get into crafting, because crafting, it's a little hard to make a crafting system that isn't bookkeeping intensive, just because you got to have all the ingredients and whatnot. But I'd say it's probably it will probably be fairly simple for you to go through. The thing I would say is, if you have a group that you're planning to run it with, sit down and go over it with them. Because I found in my experience, if you kind of learn the rules with your party, it means that everybody can kind of pick it up a little bit faster, assuming your party can pay attention for more than 5 seconds.
When we took the book on, we figured that we would probably sell a lot of copies to people who love the video game and wanted more background information and had never played a tabletop game in their life. So it was Cody's mission to make it such that that person could pick it up and play it.
As best as possible, while still keeping complexity.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, we got the other question first over there, then back there, and then we're going to jump up this way.
Okay.
Just looking forward towards supplements. I'm wondering if there was going to be, if you had given any thought to the time when the Witchers were at their power, at their peak. And
I have thought about that in the past. I have thought about doing sort of like a golden age of Witchers type situation. Probably, if I did that, I would probably have sort of. There's 2 ways that I would do that. Neither of these have been agreed on by our Telstorian games. The first is I definitely would love to do a Witcher supplement at some point, which would go into more detail about the schools and how you actually become a Witcher and whatnot. Might even have sort of like a sort of almost prequel adventure for those of you who went through the Witcher training and whatnot. And I might talk about that there, sort of as like an alternate setting. The alternate thought, which I'm not sure if I'll get away with, is I have thought about doing, or I'm kind of fascinated about the idea of doing a just like one book adventure setting or I guess alternate setting for just the really post-conjunction time in Witcher. Most of the countries that now are either not there or very different. Monsters have just shown up. Characters like Algier, who with his mentor Cosimo created the Witchers, are more known. People have seen them. They are still kind of around. You would see, a lot more about the Witcher schools. We might even be able to do maps of the keeps before they were destroyed, but that's kind of up in the air because that would require so much lore fabrication because there's very little information about that time period.
There's very little information about 1272. If we went back 300 years, oh good Lord, we would have to rebuild all of the countries.
I mean, it would be interesting. It would be fascinating. But it would be a lot of work.
It would, just because it would be terribly hard doesn't mean we wouldn't try.
Our next question's all the way at the back.
I noticed
At least at a glance, and it is at a glance.
Yeah.
You have the class systems, bards, craftsmen, criminals, doctors, etc. And it's very much an adventuring party from the perspective of maybe more of the hero elements. But let's say someone wanted to run a campaign of Squaretel. Is that something that is written? Is that something that is going to require some?
It actually takes. It's just a perspective change.
Sure.
All of those character classes can be played as Squaretel rebels or any number of other things. We have a small section talking about the Squaretel. A little bit of it is touched on in the world information, but for instance, Yorveth is in there as a man-at-arms. We have stats for him. We kind of assume that your players, that may just be the faction your players falls in with.
Okay.
So you could be a man-at-arms who is one of the Squaretel fighters. You could be a merchant who is a smuggler, a Havakar selling goods to the Squaretel and looting the bodies of people that are killed by the Squaretel. You can be perhaps an elven mage who has escaped the burning, or just a mage who has escaped being burned at the stake and teamed up with the Squaretel because they won't kill them. The criminal fits into that perfectly. Even the priest, there are really no priests for most of the non-humans. They don't really worship the gods in the same way that humans do, but there are druids. And there's a lot to be said for playing a druid who's basically going, our druid circles on the continent are like getting wiped out, we're being run out of our territory, and the Squaretel will allow us, if we team up with the Squaretel, maybe we can wipe out the people who are kind of wiping us out. So everything can kind of fit into that. It just sort of is the perspective you take on it.
And the help with that is also life path.
Yes.
Because you can do a non-human life path.
Yeah, life path, for those of you who haven't picked up the book or don't know it, life path, you make a series of D10 rolls that helps you sort of discover your character's background. You can technically choose most of the options, but I always suggest that people roll them randomly because you get really interesting characters out of it. And even, I've had times where people get, two things that don't line up at all, and they're like, like, how come I was, adopted by a mage, but now I'm a priest of the eternal fire, and my family were cursed into monsters. And you get to sit down with that player and go, okay, let's take this from the top. How did this happen? And at the end, a lot of times you can get really fascinating characters out of it. But your life path can allow you to tailor your character to the kind of, setup you want to have them. You can play, a bard, for instance, who you're going, I'm a dwarf, I'm from Kedwen, for instance, my family were low-class peasants, my father was killed for being a Squaretel sympathizer, and now I'm going to join up with the Squaretel and get revenge for my family. Hope that answered that.
Your next question's up here. You got 10 minutes.
Oh, got 10 minutes? Oh, gosh. Okay, real quick, because I know we're being recorded here. We have a bunch of questions from fans who sent them into the website, and I will go through when I'm not screamingly busy.
The questions from the fan will be answered at the live stream, which happens in an hour. That's the plan.
Oh, cool. Neat. So.
So this is slightly off topic, but it's important for me to know as a person.
Yeah.
Did you choose Jennifer or Triss?
Jennifer.
Okay. See, here's the thing.
Was there ever
Here's the
a
thing.
choice?
Here's the thing. I maintain. I hope she didn't leave because I chose Jennifer. No, here's the thing. Many of the characters in the games are very different than they were in the books. And Triss is one of those, and to some extent Yennefer is one of those. I maintain that if you read Last Wish, it stops being a choice. Because Yennefer and Geralt are not good for each other, but they're made for each other.
They're tied. And yeah, in the books, there really isn't a question.
Part of the problem is that, because I'm sure you've read the books from you asking me this, for those of you who have not read the books, part of the problem is that, like, through most of the books, at least the ones I've read, and she's confirmed this because she's read all the books, like, 60% of Triss's goal in life is to get with Geralt. Even when he's with Yennefer, happily married, her goal is to get with Geralt. And she will do, like, anything to make that happen.
They were in school together, and Triss uses magic to seduce Geralt. It's like, so this is your friend, huh? Also,
not saying that Yennefer is a great person.
No, Yennefer is a broken person, and so's Geralt. And
she does.
Ciri is kind of getting that way, but they all fit together as a family.
Yeah.
There is a scene in one of the books where...
spoilers. Anybody doesn't want spoilers, just cover your ears right now.
Really quickly, she's about to go off to the Sedna Abyss and do something terrible, dangerous, and thinks, maybe I'm not going to come back. And she contacts Triss. And we find out that Philippa Eilhart, who is certainly one of the sources of evil in the world, is standing right behind her listening to the whole conversation. And she comes on, and Yennefer says, look, right now people think I was a traitor, and, if I die out there, will you please clear my name? And Philippa says, no, that's not useful to us mages. And she says, okay, but please, Geralt, please give Geralt the real story. And she goes, oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to do that. And Yennefer's like, Triss is right there! I'm sorry, that's just unacceptable.
So yes, I'm sure some of you will try to find us after the seminar and attack us, but there you go.
They are selling Witcher swords.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Plus the fact that we found as we read and studied and tore this thing apart, we've both become secret Nilfgaardians.
Yes.
Because, as I say, in the end, it's Radovid or Nilfgaard.
What we're going to do is we're going to wrap up the video.
Okay.
The next people in this room is her, Mike Pondsmith, and our other compatriot for Castle Falkenstein, Jay Libby. Not Jay Libby, Jay Gray.
You weren't supposed to get here yet.
Jay Gray. And so after we shut this down, he's going to wrap this up, and you can come and ask me questions, and we can ask those during the live stream and have him answer some more. So if you got any last questions, you can come ask me. We'll get them recorded. Last minutes?
Okay. I hope I was able to answer people's questions and break some hearts.
Look at that thing.
I'm excited for everybody out there to get a chance to play the game. It's cheesy as hell, but I wrote this game for all the people who wanted to have adventures in Witcher World that didn't get to play their own adventure.
And